There's a bit of a trend amongst reptile YouTubers at the minute for reviewing subscribers' setups, so taking a look at images of setups that subscribers have sent in and sort of saying whether they are good or bad or what could be improved about them. Now people have asked me would I do this, and it's something that I am considering. If there's enough interest for it, then perhaps I'll do it. But for today I thought I would do something similar but slightly different. I'm going to be reviewing my own enclosures from years gone by. What I would like to illustrate in today's video is that you don't start off keeping reptiles in enclosures like that one. You always are going to start off somewhere more simple. You're going to make mistakes, and over the years, if you are a forward thinking reptile keeper, you will correct those mistakes and improve your enclosures. So with that in mind, why don't we start having a look at the very first enclosure that I set up for a reptile. So this first enclosure was an Exoterra large flat faunarium. Now this was for Cleo the leopard gecko, who I've no longer got. Now before it disappears off screen, notice the tin foil below the enclosure. That was because I just had a heat mat underneath it, and there was no lighting or anything. There was a heat mat underneath it, not on a thermostat, and we just had tin foil underneath it to sort of reflect the heat upwards so that it didn't damage the sideboard. It was a really Mickey Mouse setup, to be honest with you. You can see that there's not very much in the way of enrichment in there. There's no loose substrate for digging, and there's no climbing opportunities. But even so, this enclosure at the time, I thought it was the bee's knees, because I'd spent a lot of time researching how you were meant to keep a leopard gecko, and all the sort of big breeder videos that I came up with on YouTube were telling me that you should put them on paper, you shouldn't have lighting for them, that is the way you keep them, and that's what I thought, that's what I did. It's completely and utterly wrong, but I was trying my best. So after not too long, I decided that the faunarium wasn't enough space for Cleo and moved her into a wooden enclosure which was 60 centimetres long, so a little bit larger. It was taller as well, so there could have been climbing opportunities, but I didn't really make much use of the space. Now noticing that Morio worm or super worm that was just in the bowl, I will say that at this time I only fed Cleo mealworms and Morio worms because they were less hassle than crickets, and they were also the only things that I could get her to eat, which ain't too good. But now this enclosure, in terms of heating and lighting, didn't have any lighting, but we'd gone from a heat mat to a ceramic heat emitter, which I just had on a thermostat to keep the enclosure at 30 degrees. Now, as I've said about in lots of recent videos, ceramic heat emitters don't offer any near infrared, so infrared A and infrared B, and consequently they don't have any influence on facilitating basking. Of course you need visible light and ultraviolet for basking as well, but with no other lighting, I wasn't even getting close to this at this stage. So basically this was a really simple setup and totally inadequate. Okay, so after this I moved Cleo into a glass Exoterra enclosure. This was 60 centimetres side to side, 45 centimetres front to back, and 30 centimetres tall. So it was the biggest enclosure she'd ever had, but still it was just no loose substrate, all plastic and resin decorations, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not my tastes these days. Now this was the first time that she actually had lighting on an enclosure, but it was just a very low powered LED, so I suppose it would help with day-night cycles, but it wasn't really doing very much. There was no ultraviolet lighting, no infrared from a tungsten halogen lamp or anything like that. I just had a heat mat stuck to the bottom, and because that enclosure was all glass and the heat mat was actually on a thermostat this time, it made sure that there was just like a patch at the bottom of the enclosure which was at 30 degrees, and so if she wanted to raise her body temperature she would have to go and sit on that patch, which is just not how reptiles would naturally thermoregulate. Basically, apart from that patch of warm glass on the bottom, the enclosure was stone cold. Now moving on, I did decide to add loose substrate to this enclosure, which on the enrichment side of things was a good change because it was going to allow Cleo to dig, and she did definitely dig, but with the rest of the enclosure still being that bad, just having a little heat mat taped to the bottom and also just having a low powered LED, I wouldn't actually recommend using loose substrate in an enclosure like that. I mean, the first thing I'd recommend is just changing the enclosure because it's bad. But if you are going to use loose substrate with an animal which isn't properly energetically provisioned, then that is when the impaction risk actually becomes real. And so with this, I suppose I was actually taking a chance. But again, I did not know this at the time. I thought I was doing my best. So the next change that I made to this enclosure was I actually used UV lighting for the first time. I just had a 7% output compact UVB bulb by Arcadia. Now, I didn't have a solar meter at the time, so I couldn't say what UV indices I was providing Cleo with, but I would hazard a guess that they might have been about right. Don't know, was just complete guesswork really. So, you know, this was the first real significant improvement on the way I was keeping Cleo. Now, actually, a little bit of sort of a trivial story, I suppose, is that the reason I moved her into a glass enclosure rather than a wooden one was that when I made that first change from wooden to glass, I had been reading about UVB lighting for the very first time and was considering offering it to Cleo. But the thing was, I didn't understand all of the fittings and different bits and pieces you would need to put UV lighting inside a wooden enclosure, whereas for a glass enclosure it's simple, you just like sit a canopy on top, so I could get that. We've all got to start somewhere. But no, the reason that I never put UVB lighting on her straight away when I moved her into the glass enclosure was actually because I saw UVB lighting as something new and scary and not properly tested. So initially I wasn't really ready to take the plunge into using it. I thought it would just be safer to carry on using oral D3 supplementation like I always had done. Now, as it happened, I made this really depressing video just after Cleo died on the 31st of January 2017. Doesn't really surprise me that I only had her for less than 3 years, because even now through all of this time I was reading loads of care sheets about leopard geckos and trying to take all the advice from the YouTube experts. I needn't name them. The way I was keeping her was still crap. And she died. So a few weeks after Cleo died, I did get a new leopard gecko, which is in fact Speckles the leopard gecko, which is the male leopard gecko that I've still got today. Which is quite funny actually, looking back and seeing how small he was, because he's absolutely massive now. But anyway, the way I had him initially was just back in the Exoterra faunarium. That was the original setup I had for him, just with like the heat mat on the bottom and that. That was on a thermostat this time. But that was just a quarantine setup. I had no intention of keeping him like that long term. So after being in quarantine for a while, I actually moved Speckles into Cleo's old 60cm long, 45cm front to back and 30cm tall glass Exoterra enclosure. And on it, for heating and lighting, I had the 7% compact UVB bulb by Arcadia again, and I had a ceramic heat emitter on this time. So it was an improvement on how this enclosure was before I first put Cleo in it, and you can see as well that I did have loose substrate. But the main thing I want to point out here is that having a ceramic heat emitter on top of a glass enclosure like this really isn't that effective, even at just warming the enclosure. Obviously it's not good because it's not going to allow the animal to bask properly, but the way that ceramic heat emitters work is they just sort of warm the air for the most part. They also give off some infrared C, which isn't the useful stuff for basking. It's just what's given out by like slightly warm objects. But anyway, when the warm air is coming off the ceramic heat emitter, it's sort of going to fill up the dome and then be like jetting out the holes in the top, if you understand. And then when it sort of pushes out the bottom of the dome, it's just going to come out and round it like an upside down waterfall. So it's not even an effective way at getting heat into the enclosure, never mind providing proper radiation. So this next enclosure I did was the best one so far in terms of enrichment, because it was my very first bioactive enclosure for a leopard gecko. I had done one bioactive enclosure before for my crested gecko, but this was the first one that I did for a leopard gecko. Now I say this was the best in terms of enrichment because obviously there's the loose substrate for digging, and using all the cork bark and decorations like that, the geckos leopard geckos are actually able to climb these things as opposed to resin hides, which they pretty much just slip off. So it was making more use of the volume of the enclosure, turning it into something that Speckles could walk around on. But aside from this sort of enrichment aspect, the bioactive enclosure isn't actually any better than the previous one that I had. It's literally basically the climbing space is the only thing that's different about it, and I suppose hunting the custodians, which he definitely did and still does do in his current bioactive enclosure. But the heating and lighting in here was literally the same as I had just had. So the next enclosure I did is actually the same vivarium that I've got Speckles in now, and this is 3 feet long, just shy of 2 feet front to back and just shy of 2 feet tall, and it was and still is a bioactive enclosure. So it's got the loose substrate which is going to allow digging, and initially it just had cork bark sort of on the flat, so there weren't really any proper climbing opportunities in here, but certainly in terms of like the space and enrichment, this was by far the best enclosure that I'd had to date. Now in terms of heating and lighting in this enclosure, I had UVB lighting, and I also had an Arcadia DP projector. So that meant that for the very first time I was providing a leopard gecko with all of the key components of sunlight, so UVB, UVA, visible light, infrared A and infrared B. So Speckles at this point could bask, only the problem is I probably was not offering these like wavelengths in the right intensities and compositions. So for instance, the DP projector offers a composition of infrared A and infrared B, which is less reminiscent of that encountered in sunlight than is offered by a simple incandescent lamp or tungsten halogen lamp. So basically this enclosure was getting there, but it wasn't quite perfect. So the first major change that I made to this enclosure was I actually built the background and sort of side ground pieces, if that's what you want to call them. And basically this was just allowing Speckles to use more of the space within the enclosure. Because we've said this in like podcasts and other videos before, but reptiles are not fish. They don't swim around, they don't care about the volume of the enclosure, they care about how much usable space there is. And so having these background pieces and allowing Speckles to climb was literally increasing his living space. So this was definitely a good move. As you can see, I still just had the Arcadia DP projector though. So the next and sort of most recent major changes to the enclosure have been the addition of a tungsten halogen lamp, and with the addition of this I was and am finally offering proper basking conditions as far as I understand. I'm sure in the future that we'll make further improvements, and you know, that's sort of the theme of this video really, is that you can be doing things and think you are doing the best thing at the time, but in the future you're probably going to learn new information and then come back round and realise what you were doing in the past actually was wrong. So the other recent major change made to this enclosure has been the addition of 2 female leopard geckos, Dottie and Pepper, who did receive a 6-month quarantine period before that I moved them in with Speckles. Now the reason for doing this I have talked about in complete detail in another video which I'll link in, but the basic gist is leopard geckos are communal animals in nature, and you know, as they have done so in my enclosure thus far, they do generally get on quite well with each other, and consequently that social interaction can be considered a major form of enrichment. Now again, it is worth me pointing out at this time that hopefully you understand by now that I have been keeping leopard geckos for a long time, and so I'm fairly au fait with the signs of stress and just the general mannerisms and behaviour. So if the cohabitation wasn't working out, then I would know to separate them, and also because of all old enclosures I've got sat round empty, I do have the capacity to separate them if required. And of course the other thing is, there is a lot of usable space in this enclosure, and I at least think, I suppose in the future we might come back round and I'll think I was wrong, but anyway, I think that I am offering them with the correct radiation from the lamps, and consequently they should have everything they need, and therefore there shouldn't be battles for resources. But anyway, having said everything I want to about leopard geckos for today, why don't we take a look at my journey through keeping my corn snake Red. So the first thing I can point out here is that Red the corn snake was actually very small when I got him. He was only 16 grams, so if you've seen him in recent videos, and I suppose you'll see him in a minute anyway, he is very much larger than that today. Now this first enclosure I had him in was 45 centimetres long, 30 centimetres deep, and literally about 6 inches tall, so it was an absolutely tiny enclosure with no climbing opportunities, no lighting, and just a little heat mat on the bottom, which I would consider totally inadequate today, but once again, that was what I had heard from all the big breeders on the internet, and consequently that is what I thought was the best thing to do. Quite interestingly, despite Red the corn snake being incredibly good with food these days, he never misses a meal, he always strikes, he's actually getting pretty aggressive when it comes to feeding. Originally he wasn't, and in this first enclosure he used to regurgitate quite often or just generally refuse food, so whether that is connected to the enclosure or not, I suppose I can't say, but I might as well put it out there. So Red's next enclosure was basically the same as his first one, only it was bigger, so it was slightly taller, and it was 3 feet long, and then maybe 45 centimetres front to back, I think. But even so, it was still a rubbish enclosure. There was no lighting for it, and it just had a heat mat on the bottom. I think at this point Red had actually started eating a bit better. He did have a funny period where for a couple of months he just stopped, but largely he was a lot better on that front. But again, about the enclosure, I would still consider it woefully inadequate. The next enclosure I did for Red was a massive improvement. This time it was 115 centimetres long, 37.5 centimetres deep I want to say, and like 45 tall, something around those values. He did have something in the way of climbing opportunities for the first time, but the biggest improvement was the fact that instead of just having a heat mat, I had a ceramic heat emitter, which still is not a good heater for the reasons that I've discussed already about the leopard geckos, i.e. it doesn't provide any of the beneficial radiation found in sunlight, but it is more suitable than a heat mat for the reason that it actually warms up the air in the enclosure rather than just the surface. Now the other thing is that in this enclosure I did have UVB lighting for Red. It was a T8 2% output UVB bulb, so the UV indices offered were probably very, very low, lower than I would recommend offering a corn snake, so it wasn't really doing very much, but it was a start, and I suppose that's what matters. The next change for Red was that I turned this enclosure into a bioactive one. So in terms of enrichment, it was definitely the best that he'd ever had, because there was more different materials in the enclosure for him to contact, different things for him to smell, and I suppose there was, well, in terms of climbing opportunities, it was about the same as the previous enclosure, but generally it wasn't really that much better than the previous setup, because the heating and lighting was exactly the same and the enclosure was still the same size, which to be honest I would consider to be too small for a corn snake. The next enclosure that I put Red in is actually the same vivarium that he is in now, which is 5 feet long, 2 feet front to back and 2 feet tall, which is a decent size for him, especially when I've started making better use of the volume, which is what we'll talk about in a moment. But when I first set it up, there were some climbing opportunities here, which was good, but the heating and lighting was basically it was the exact same as what was in the previous enclosure. I just moved it over to this one, so we had the ceramic heat emitter and the 2% output T8 UVB bulb. So this enclosure is the same as the last one pretty much, bioactive and all that. It was just bigger. Over the years I have made multiple changes to this enclosure, so sort of the first big one that you notice when you go and look at it is I have added lots more branches. I did this sometime last year, and I'm really glad I've done it because Red makes great use of them. He's forever sleeping up his branches. I think he sleeps up his branches more often than he actually sleeps buried under a hide, which was sort of surprising to me at first that he would do that, but now it's just sort of normal now. I've got used to seeing it. So that's definitely good. But the other major changes that have been made to his heating and lighting. So instead of the ceramic heat emitter, he might have had a period with a deep heat projector, but anyway, today, and also in this video with the branches being added, I had given him tungsten halogen lamps at this point, so he had ultraviolet radiation, some visible light, and also a decent composition of near infrared, and consequently from that point onwards he has been able to bask properly. Just in the past couple of days I have made some further changes to Red the Corn Snake's enclosure, which I've not actually shown in a video yet, so I'll have his enclosure up on screen now so that you can sort of see it, but I'm actually going to save off talking about the specific changes that I've made for a video that I am working on. So as you can see, my corn snake, the way that I've been keeping him over the years, has changed just as much as it has with my leopard gecko cur. And, you know, again, I hope that illustrates the point that even if you start out doing what you think is right, you can be very, very wrong, and the important thing about it is not to dwell on what you're doing and say, oh no, this is right because that's what I read on this curse sheet. It's to recognise that what you're doing is wrong, that there is new information available, and that you can act on this information in order to better the welfare of your animal. So in this video, I would also like to take a look at what I have done with Char the Bearded Dragon over the years, because the way that I've been keeping him has changed significantly also. Now you can see this first enclosure, which was just a quarantine enclosure, so it was really, really basic, just newspaper, no loose substrate, and that's sort of forgivable, but the real thing that I want to point out is the heating and lighting and just how awful it is. So he had a ceramic heat emitter at one end of the enclosure, which was supposed to be providing basking conditions, which, as I've already discussed, it really is not. I also had a second ceramic heat emitter, which was like a backup for if the first one broke or something, which I suppose is reasonably sensible. But then aside from that, I literally just had a T5 14% output UVB bulb. This rig is bad for a bearded dragon for the same reasons that it is for a leopard gecko or a corn snake, i.e. it isn't like providing all of the radiation in sunlight. You know, never mind the composition of this radiation, it's just not there at all. But I would say that this is acutely bad for a bearded dragon because they are a sun-seeking species. You know, corn snakes and leopard geckos also do this to a lesser degree, but their involvement with the radiation from sunlight is less than that for a bearded dragon, and consequently it is a more severe failure in the husbandry of a bearded dragon than it is for a corn snake or a leopard gecko. A bearded dragon will not survive 5 minutes in an exoterraformarium with a heat mat, but a corn snake or a leopard gecko can, pull through. After quarantine was done, I moved Char into a bioactive enclosure. So in terms of enrichment, this was very much better than the quarantine setup because he had something in the way of climbing opportunities, and he did have the opportunity to dig, and bearded dragons do like digging, so this was important. But the heating and lighting was literally the same as it was in the quarantine enclosure, which is to say, rubbish. So even though I didn't understand factually why the heating and lighting rig in this enclosure was inappropriate, I knew that there was something wrong with it because Char would never ever bask, and somehow that just seemed wrong. So recognising that something was up but not really knowing what to do about it, I actually changed the lighting in Char's enclosure quite a number of times. One of the first things I tried was I got shot of the ceramic heat emitter and put in a 50 watt tungsten halogen lamp as well as a 50 watt deep heat projector. The idea behind this was that I thought the deep heat projector was offering a really nice composition of infrared A and infrared B, and I thought that the tungsten halogen lamp, in offering a localized burst of visible light, would stimulate basking. Now, this general idea I would actually agree with, but the execution was incorrect. So, firstly, the tungsten halogen lamp offers a better composition of infrared A and infrared B than the deep heat projector. So, the deep heat projector was obsolete with the tungsten halogen lamp there. And also, the visible light offered by the tungsten halogen lamp is not intense at all, and consequently isn't really sufficient to stimulate basking. Because of this, I never really saw Char's behaviour improve that much. He still didn't seem to bask in a way that felt right to me, and I kept changing about his heating and lighting. You'll see in this rendition of the enclosure I had a deep heat projector paired with a ceramic heat emitter, which is worse than the deep heat projector tungsten halogen lamp combo, but I really didn't understand what I was doing at this point, so I was just trying different things and hoping that it would work, which it didn't. But you will see that I did change out the layout in the enclosure, so I added some red sand in there to make it look more outback. I doubt that Char cares about this, but it's still like that to this day, and I think it looks reasonably good. But what I also did is I moved the decor around so that there was sort of more free space. Because I sort of discovered that bearded dragons charge around at full speed a lot, rather than investigating every little nook and cranny like a corn snake or leopard gecko would, which was sort of what I was more familiar with. And therefore, the way that I had originally set up the enclosure, it just had a lot of clutter in it that was getting in his way. The next sort of decoration change that I made to the enclosure was introducing some large branches for Char to climb up, because he couldn't climb the previous branches I had, they were just too thin. But, you know, I knew that bearded dragons were meant to be semi-arboreal in the wild, and so climbing opportunities are very important to them, and that was why I tried adding these large branches. And sort of similarly to the case with my corn snake, I found that Char does climb one hell of a lot, and actually he sleeps up his branches more often than anywhere else. I actually think that since I put the branches in, he hasn't actually chosen to sleep anywhere except up a branch. The most recent changes to Char's enclosure have basically just all been lighting changes, and finally I've got a lighting rig where Char behaves in a way that seems right. He wakes up in the morning, goes and has a bask, and then starts charging round the enclosure, going to the basking site every now and again for just very short top-ups, if that's what you want to call them. And you know, it just seems right rather than hanging about at the cool end of the enclosure all day, which is what he used to do. I've made a video pretty recently discussing this lighting rig in detail, but to very, very quickly run through it, I've got a very bright LED, a spot LED, which is providing visible light intensities at the basking spot, akin to something that you would expect to find during the daytime. I've also got a tungsten halogen lamp, which is offering the near infrared. I've got two UV lamps, which are timed separately to ramp up the UV indices throughout the day, and I've also got a 3-foot Jungle Dawn LED bar, which is providing reasonable background levels of visible light. So hopefully Char has helped to illustrate how my thoughts and ideas about heating and lighting have developed over the years. Now, as it happens, another thing that I've learned about bearded dragons is that they are sodding big lizards, and they are bloody active as well, and the 5x2x2 foot enclosure that I've always had him in, it's not big enough. You know, people in the States keep these things in 40-gallon breeders, which I think are 3 feet long, 1.5 feet front to back, and 1.5 feet tall, which is ridiculously too small for a bearded dragon. And sort of in recognition of the fact that my enclosure is too small, later this year I do plan on moving Char to a bigger enclosure which will be 10 feet long, 2.5 feet front to back, and 2'1" or something like that tall. So that'll be the next major change for him. But anyway, having discussed those 3 instances of my development with reptiles, I think that we can draw this video to a close. I could go on at length about the other reptiles that I've got and the changes in their enclosures over the years, but I've just picked these 3 because these are the 3 that have seen the most significant changes in the way that I have been keeping them. So I hope that this video has illustrated that reptile keeping is not about finding the right information and following it perfectly from day one. Reptile keeping is about progression. We don't know everything about keeping these animals, and all the time new information is coming out, and it is our duty as the owners of these animals to keep up to date with that information and change the way that we are keeping them to suit. But anyway, for today, I've been JTB Reptiles, teaching you how to follow nature's example. I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys.